Francis Bacon, The Wisdom of the Ancients. Perseus, or War. Perseus was sent, it is said, by Pallas to cut off the head of Medusa, from whom many nations in the westernmost parts of Spain suffered grievous calamities. A monster so dreadful and so horrible that the mere sight of her turned men into stone. She was one of the Gorgons, and the only one of them that was mortal, the others not being subject to change. By way of equipment for this so noble exploit, Perseus received arms and gifts from 3 several gods. Mercury gave him wings for his feet. Pluto gave him a helmet. Pallas a shield and a mirror. And yet, though so well provided and equipped, he did not proceed against Medusa directly, but went out of his way to visit the Gree. These were half-sisters to the Gorgons, and had been born old women with white hair. They had but one eye and one tooth among them, and these they used to wear by turns, each putting them on as she went abroad, and putting them off again when she came back. This eye and tooth they now lent to Perseus. Whereupon, judging himself sufficiently equipped for the performance of his undertaking, he went against Medusa with all haste, flying. He found her asleep, but not daring to face her in case she should wake, he looked back into Pallas's mirror, and taking aim by reflection, cut off her head. From the blood which flowed out of the wound, there suddenly leaped forth the winged Pegasus. The severed head was fixed by Perseus in Pallas's shield, where it still retained its power of striking stiff, as if thunder or planet-stricken, all who looked on it. The fable seems to have been composed with reference to the art and judicious conduct of war. And first, for the kind of war to be chosen, it sets forth, as from the advice of Pallas, 3 sound and weighty precepts to guide the deliberation. The first is, not to take any great trouble for the subjugation of the neighboring nations. For the rule to be followed in the enlarging of a patrimony does not apply to the extension of an empire. In a private property, the vicinity of the estates to each other is of importance, but in extending an empire, occasion and facility of carrying the war through, and value of conquest, should be regarded instead of vicinity. We see that the Romans, while they had hardly penetrated westward beyond Ligurgia, had conquered and included in their empire eastern provinces as far off as Mount Taurus. And therefore Perseus, though he belonged to the east, did not decline a distant expedition to the uttermost parts of the west. The second is that there be a just and honorable cause of war. For this begets alacrity as well in the soldiers themselves as in the people from whom the supplies are to come. Also it opens the way to alliances and conciliates friends, and has a great many advantages. Now there is no cause of war more pious than the overthrow of a tyranny under which the people lies prostrate without spirit or vigor, as if turned to stone by the aspect of that very Medusa. Thirdly, it is wisely added that whereas there are 3 Gorgons, by whom are represented wars, Perseus chose the one that was mortal, that is, he chose such a war as might be finished and carried through, and did not engage in the pursuit of vast or infinite projects. The equipment of Perseus is of that kind which is everything in war, and almost ensures success. For he received swiftness from Mercury, secrecy of counsel from Pluto, and providence from Pallas. Nor is the circumstance that those wings of swiftness were for the heels and not for the shoulders without an allegorical meaning, and a very wise one at that. For it is not in the first attack, so much as in those that follow up and support the first, that swiftness is required, and there is no error more common in war than that of not pressing on the secondary and subsidiary actions with an activity answerable to the vigor of the beginnings. There is also an ingenious distinction implied in the images of the shield and the mirror, for the parable of Pluto's helmet, which made men invisible, needs no explanation, between the 2 kinds of foresight. For we must have not only that kind of foresight which acts as a shield, but that other kind likewise, which enables us, like Pallas's mirror, to spy into the forces and movements and counsels of the enemy. But Perseus, however provided with forces and courage, stands yet in need of one thing more before the war be commenced, which is of the highest possible importance. He must go round to the Gree. These Gree are treasons, which are indeed war's sisters, yet not sisters German, but as it were of less noble birth. For wars are generous, treasons degenerate and base. They are prettily described in allusion to the perpetual cares and trepidations of traitors, as old and white from their birth. Their power, before they break out into the open revolt, lies either in the eye or the tooth. For all factions, when alienated from the state, both play and spy and bite. And the eye and tooth are as it were common to them all. The eye, because all their information is handed from one to another, and circulates through the whole party. The tooth, because they all bite with one mouth, and all tell one tale, so that when you hear one, you hear all. Therefore, Perseus must make friends of those Gree, that they may lend him their eye and their tooth. The eye for discovery of information, the tooth to sow rumors, raise envy, and stir the minds of the people. These matters being thus arranged and prepared, we come next to the carriage of the war itself. And here we see that Perseus finds Medusa asleep, for the undertaker of a war almost always, if he is wise, takes his enemy unprepared and in security. And now it is that Pallas's mirror is wanted. For there are many who before the hour of danger can look into the enemy's affairs sharply and attentively, but the chief use of the mirror is in the very instant of peril, that you may examine the manner of it without being confused by the fear of it, which is meant by looking at it with eyes averted. The conclusion of the war is followed by 2 effects. First, the birth and springing up of Pegasus, which obviously enough denotes fame, flying abroad and celebrating the victory. Secondly, the carrying of Medusa's head upon the shield, for this is incomparably the best kind of safeguard. A single brilliant and memorable exploit, happily conducted and accomplished, paralyzes all the enemy's movements and mates malevolence itself. Orpheus, or philosophy. The study of Orpheus, which though so well known, has not yet been in all points perfectly well interpreted, seems meant for a representation of universal philosophy. For Orpheus himself, a man admirable and truly divine, who being master of all harmony, subdued and drew all things after him by sweet and gentle measures, may pass by an easy metaphor for philosophy personified. For as the works of wisdom surpass in dignity and power the works of strength, so the labors of Orpheus surpass the labors of Heracles. Orpheus, moved by affection for his wife, who had been snatched from him by an untimely death, resolved to go down to hell and beg her back again of the infernal powers. Trusting to his lyre, nor was he disappointed, for so soothed and charmed were the infernal powers by the sweetness of his singing and playing, that they gave him leave to take her away with him, but upon one condition. She was to follow behind him, and he was not to look back until they had reached the confines of light. From this, however, in the impatience of love and anxiety, he could not refrain. Before he had quite reached the point of safety, he looked back, and so the covenant was broken, and she suddenly fell away from him and was hurried back into hell. From that time, Orpheus betook himself into solitary places, a melancholy man and averse from the sight of women, where by the same sweetness of his song and lyre he drew to him all kinds of wild beasts, in such manner that, putting off their several natures, forgetting all their quarrels and ferocity, no longer driven by the stings and furies of lust, no longer caring to satisfy their hunger or to hunt their prey, they all stood about him gently and sociably, as in a theatre, listening only to the concords of his lyre. Nor was that all, for so great was the power of his music that it moved the woods and the very stones to shift themselves and take their stations decently and orderly about him. And all this went on for some time with happy success and great admiration, till at last certain Thracian women, under the stimulation and excitement of Bacchus, came where he was. And first they blew such a hoarse and hideous blast upon a horn that the sound of his music could no longer be heard for the din. Whereupon, the charm being broken that had been the bond of that order and good fellowship, confusion began again. The beasts returned, each to his several nature, and preyed one upon the other as before. The stones and woods stayed no longer in their places, while Orpheus himself was torn to pieces by the women in their fury, and his limbs scattered about the fields. At whose death Helicon, river sacred to the Muses, in grief and indignation, buried his waters under the earth to reappear elsewhere. The meaning of the fable appears to be this. The singing of Orpheus is of two kinds. One, to propitiate the infernal powers. The other, to draw the wild beasts and the woods. The former may be best understood as referring to natural philosophy, the latter to philosophy moral and civil. For natural philosophy proposes to itself, as its noblest work of all, nothing less than the restitution and renovation of things corruptible, and, what is indeed the same thing in a lower degree, the conversation of bodies in the state in which they are, and the retardation of dissolution and putrefaction. Now certainly, if this can be effected at all, it cannot be otherwise than by due and exquisite attempering, and adjustment of parts in nature, as by the harmony and perfect modulation of a lyre. And yet, being a thing of all others the most difficult, it commonly fails of effect, and fails, it may be, from no cause more than from curious and premature meddling and impatience. Then philosophy finds that her great work is too much for her, in sorrowful mood, as well becomes her, turns to human affairs, and applying her powers of persuasion and eloquence to insinuate into men's minds the love of virtue and equity and peace, teaches the peoples to assemble and unite and take upon them the yoke of laws and submit to authority, and forget their ungoverned appetites in listening and conforming to precepts and discipline. Whereupon soon follows the building of houses, the founding of cities, the planting of fields and gardens with trees, insomuch that the stones and the woods are not unfitly said to leave their places and come about her. And this application of philosophy to civil affairs is properly represented, and according to the true order of things, as subsequent to the diligent trial and final frustration of the experiment of restoring the dead body to life. For true it is that the clearer the recognition of the inevitable necessity of death sets men upon seeking immortality by merit and renown. Also, it is wisely added in the story that Orpheus was averse from women and from marriage, for the sweets of marriage and the dearness of children commonly draw men away from performing great and lofty services to the commonwealth, being content to be perpetuated in their race and stock, and not in their deeds. But howsoever the works of wisdom are among human things, the most excellent, yet they too have their periods and closes. For so it is that after kingdoms and commonwealths have flourished for a time, there arise perturbations and seditions and wars, amid the uproars of which first the laws are put to silence, and then men return to the depraved conditions of their nature, and desolation is seen in the fields and in the cities. And if such troubles last, it is not long before letters also and philosophy are so torn in pieces that no traces of them can be found, but a few fragments scattered here and there like planks from a shipwreck. And then a season of barbarism sets in, the waters of Helicon being sunk under the ground until, according to the appointed vicissitude of things, they break out and issue forth again, perhaps among other nations, and not in the places where they were before. Prometheus, or the state of man. Tradition says that man was made by Prometheus and made of clay. Only that Prometheus took particles from different animals and mixed them in. He, desiring to benefit and protect his own work, and to be regarded not as the founder only, but also as the amplifier and enlarger of the human race, stole up to heaven with a bundle of fennel stalks in his hand, kindled them at the chariot of the sun, and so brought fire to the earth and presented it to mankind. For this so great benefit received at his hands, men, it is said, were far from being grateful. So far, indeed, that they conspired together and impeached him and his invention before Jupiter. This act of theirs was not so taken as justice may seem to have required, for the accusation proved very acceptable both to Jupiter and the rest of the gods. And so delighted were they that they not only indulged mankind with the use of fire, but presented them likewise with a new gift of all others most agreeable and desirable: perpetual youth. Overjoyed with this, the foolish people put the gift of the gods on the back of an ass. The ass was on his way home, being troubled with extreme thirst, came to a fountain, but a serpent that was set to guard it would not let him drink unless he gave in payment whatever that was that he carried on his back. The poor ass accepted the condition, and so for a mouthful of water the power of renewing youth was transferred from men to serpents. After mankind had lost their prize, Prometheus made up his quarrel with them, but retaining his malice and being bitterly incensed against Jupiter, he did not scruple to tempt him with deceit, even in the act of sacrifice. Having slain, it is said, 2 bulls, he stuffed the hide of one of them with the flesh and fat of both, and bringing them to the altar, with an air of devotion and benignity, offered Jupiter his choice. Jupiter, detesting his craft and bad faith, but knowing how to requite it, chose the mock bull. Then, bethinking him of vengeance, and seeing that there was no way to take down the insolence of Prometheus except by chastising the human race, of which work he was extravagantly vain and proud, ordered Vulcan to make a fair and lovely woman. When she was made, each of the gods bestowed upon her his several gift, whence she was called Pandora. Then they placed in her hands an elegant vase, in which were enclosed all mischiefs and calamities. Only at the bottom there remained hope. With her vase in her hand, she repaired first of all to Prometheus to see if he would take it and open it, which he, cautious and cunning, declined. Thus rejected, she went away to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, but of a character entirely different, who opened it without hesitation. But as soon as he saw all the mischiefs rushing out, growing wise when it was far too late, he struggled to get the lid on again as fast as possible, but it was all he could do to keep in the last of the party, which was hope, that lay at the bottom. In the end, Jupiter seized Prometheus and upon many and grave charges, as that of old he had stolen fire, that he had made a mock of Jupiter's majesty in that deceitful sacrifice, that he had scorned and rejected his gift, together with another not mentioned before, that he had attempted to ravish Minerva, threw him into chains, and condemned him to perpetual tortures. For by Jupiter's command he was dragged to Mount Caucasus, and there bound fast to a column so that he could not stir. And there was an eagle which gnawed and consumed his liver by day. And what was eaten in the day grew again in the night, so that matter was never wanting for the torture to work upon. Yet they say that this punishment had its end at last, for Heracles sailed across the ocean in a cup that was given to him by the sun, came to the Caucasus, shot the eagle with his arrows, and set Prometheus free. In honor of Prometheus, there were instituted in some nations games called torch races, in which the runners carried lighted torches in their hands, and if any went out, the bearers stood aside, leaving the victory to those that followed. And the first who reached the goal, with his torch still burning, received the prize. This fable carries in it many true and grave speculations, both on the surface and underneath. For there are some things in it that have been long ago observed. Others have never been touched at all. Prometheus clearly and expressly signifies providence, and the one thing singled out by the ancients as the special and peculiar work of providence was the creation and the constitution of man. For this one reason, no doubt was, that the nature of man includes mind and intellect, which is the seat of providence. And since to derive mind and reason from principles brutal and irrational would be harsh and incredible, it follows almost necessarily that the human spirit was endued with providence not without the precedent and intention and warrant of the greater providence. But this was not all. The chief aim of the parable appears to be that man, if we look to final causes, may be regarded as the center of the world, insomuch that if man were taken away from the world, the rest would seem to be all astray, without aim or purpose, to be like a besom without a binding, as the saying is, and to be leading to nothing. For the whole world works together in the service of man, and there is nothing from which he does not derive use and fruit. The revolutions and courses of the stars serve him both for distinction of the seasons and distribution of the quarters of the world. The appearances of the middle sky afford him prognostications of weather. The winds hail his ships and work his mills and engines. Plants and animals of all kinds are made to furnish him either with dwelling and shelter, or clothing, or food, or medicine, or to lighten his labor, or to give him pleasure and comfort. Insomuch that all things seem to be going about man's business and not their own. Nor is it without meaning added that in the mass and composition of which man was made, particles taken from the different animals were infused and mixed up with the clay. For it is most true that of all things in the universe, man is the most composite, so that he was not without reason called by the ancients the little world. For though the alchemists, when they maintain that there is to be found in man every mineral, every vegetable, etc., or something corresponding to them, take the word microcosm, in a sense too gross and literal, and having so spoiled the elegance and distorted the meaning of it, yet that the body of man is, of all existing things, both the most mixed and the most organic, remains not the less a sober and solid truth. And this is indeed the reason it is capable of such wonderful powers and faculties. For the powers of simple bodies, though they be certain and rapid, yet being less refracted, broken up, and counteracted by mixture, they are few. But abundance and excellence of power resides in mixture and in composition. Nevertheless, we see that man in the first stage of his existence is a naked and defenseless thing, slow to help himself, and very much full of wants. Therefore Prometheus applied himself with all haste to the invention of fire, which in all human necessities and business is the great minister of relief and help, insomuch that if the soul be the form of forms, and the hand the instrument of instruments, fire may rightly be called the help of helps and the mean of means. For through it most operations are effected. Through it the arts, mechanical, and the sciences themselves are furthered in an infinite variety of ways. Now the description of the manner in which the theft of fire was accomplished is apt and according to the nature of the thing. It was by applying a stalk of fennel to the chariot of the sun. For fennel is used as a rod to strike with. The meaning, therefore, clearly is that fire is produced by violent percussions and collisions of one body with another, whereby the matter they are made of is attenuated and set in motion, and prepared to receive the heat of the celestial bodies, and so, by clandestine processes, as by an act of theft, snatches fire, as it were, from the chariot of the sun. There follows a remarkable part of the parable. Men, we are told, instead of gratulation and thanksgiving, fell to remonstrance and indignation, and brought an accusation before Jupiter, both against Prometheus and against fire. And this was, moreover, by him so well liked, that in consideration of it he accumulated fresh benefits upon mankind. For how should the crime of ingratitude towards their Maker, a vice which includes in itself almost all others, deserve approbation and reward? And what could be the drift of such a fiction? But this is not what is meant. The meaning of the allegory is that the accusation and arraignment by men, both of their own nature and of art, proceeds from an excellent condition of mind and issues in good, whereas the contrary is hated by the gods and unlucky. For they who extravagantly extol human nature as it is in the arts as received, who spend themselves in admiration of what they already possess, and hold up as perfect the sciences which are professed and cultivated, are wanting, first, in reverence to the divine nature, with the perfection of which they almost presume to compare, and next, in usefulness towards man, as thinking that they have already reached the summit of things and finished their work, and therefore need seek no further. They, on the other hand, who arraign and accuse nature and the arts, and abound with complainings, are not only more modest, if it be truly considered, in their sentiment, but are also stimulated perpetually to fresh industry and new discoveries. And this makes me marvel all the more at the ignorance and evil genius of mankind, who, being overcrowded by the arrogance of a few persons, hold in such honor that philosophy of the Peripatetics, which was but a portion, and no large portion either, of the Greek philosophy, that every attempt to find fault with it has come to be not only useless, but also suspected and almost dangerous. Whereas, certainly, in my opinion, both Empedocles and Democritus, who complain, the first madly enough, but the second very soberly, that all things are hidden away from us, that we know nothing, that we discern nothing, that truth is drowned in deep wells, that the true and the false are strangely joined and twisted together, for the new academy are carried it a great deal too far, are more to be approved than the school of Aristotle, so confident and dogmatical. Therefore, let all men know that the preferring of complaints against nature and the arts is a thing well pleasing to the gods, and draws down new alms and bounties from the divine goodness, and that the accusation of Prometheus, our maker and master though he be, yea, sharp and vehement accusation, is a thing more sober and profitable than this overflow of congratulation and thanksgiving. Let them know that conceit of plenty is one of the principal causes of want. Now for the gift which men are said to have received as the reward of their accusation, namely, the unfading flower of youth. It seems to show that methods and medicines for the retardation of age and the prolongation of life were by the ancients not despaired of, but reckoned rather among those things which men once had, and by sloth and negligence let slip, than among those which were wholly denied or never offered. For they seem to say that by the true use of fire, and by the just and vigorous accusation and conviction of the errors of art, such gifts might have been compassed, and that it was not the divine goodness that was wanting to them therein, but they that were wanting to themselves, in that having received this gift of the gods, they committed the carriage of it into a lazy and slow-paced ass. By this seems to be meant experience, a thing stupid and full of delay, whose slow and tortoise-like pace gave birth to that ancient complaint that life is short and art is long. And for my own part, I certainly think that those two faculties, the dogmatical and the empirical, have not yet been well united and coupled, but that the bridging down of new gifts from the gods has ever been left either to the abstract philosophies, as to a light bird, or to sluggish and tardy experiences, as to an ass. And yet it must be said in behalf of the ass, that he might perhaps do well enough, but for the accident of thirst by the way. For if a man would put himself fairly under the command of experience, and proceed steadily onward by a certain law and method, and not let any thirst for experiments either for profit or ostentation seize him by the way, and make him lay down and unsettle his burthen in order that he may taste them, such a man, I do think, would prove a carrier to whom new and augmented measures of divine bounty might be well enough entrusted. As for the transfer of the gift to serpents, it seems to be an addition merely for ornament, unless it were inserted in shame of mankind, who with that fire of theirs, and with so many arts, cannot acquire for themselves things which nature has of herself bestowed on many other animals. The sudden reconciliation of men with Prometheus, after the frustration of their hope, contains likewise a wise and useful observation. It alludes to the levity and rashness of man in new experiments, who, if an experiment does not at once succeed according to wish, is far too great a hurry to give up the attempt as a failure, and so tumble back to where he was and take on with the old things again. Having thus described the state of man in respect of arts and matters intellectual, the parable passes to religion. For with the cultivation of the arts came likewise the worship of things divine, and this was immediately seized on and polluted by hypocrisy. Therefore, under the figure of that double sacrifice is elegantly represented the person of the truly religious man and the hypocrite. For in the one there is the fat, which is God's portion, by reason of the flame and sweet savour, whereby is meant affection, and zeal burning and rising upward for the glory of God. In him are the bowels of charity, in him wholesome and useful meat. In the other is found nothing but dry and bare bones, with which the skin is stuffed out till it looks like a fair and noble victim, whereby are signified those external and empty rites and ceremonies with which men overload and inflate the service of religion. Things rather got up for ostentation than conducing to piety. Nor is it enough for men to offer such mockeries to God, but they must also lay and father them upon himself, as though he had himself chosen and prescribed them. It is against such a kind of choice that the prophet in God's person remonstrates when he says, "Is this such a fast as I have chosen, that man should afflict his soul for one day and bow his head like a bulrush?" After touching the state of religion, the parable turns to morals and the conditions of human life. Pandora has been generally and rightly understood to mean pleasure and sensual appetite, which, after the introduction of civil arts and culture and luxury, is kindled up, as it were, by the gift of fire. To Vulcan, therefore, who in like manner represents fire, the making of pleasure is imputed, and from her have flowed forth infinite mischief upon the minds, the bodies, and the fortunes of men, together with repentance when too late, nor upon individuals only, but upon kingdoms also, and commonwealths. For from this same fountain have sprung wars and civil disturbances and tyrannies, but it is worth while to observe how prettily and elegantly the two conditions and, as it were, pictures of models of human life are set forth in the story under the persons of Prometheus and Epimetheus. The followers of Epimetheus are the improvident, who take no care for the future, but think only of what is pleasant at